Hello there. Welcome to the first of two narrated lectures on criticizing quantitative research. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the structure of a research paper and considering some of the things we should be looking for when reading and criticizing a research paper. This lecture isn't a comprehensive guide on all things relating to paper critique techniques. It only serves as an outline and overview of some of the more important things that you might want to look out for. As you become more experienced in criticizing research, you'll find that the criticism is tailored to the design and objectives of the paper and to what you want to get out of the paper. Okay, without further ado, let's start the lecture proper. In your first year of undergraduate studies, you probably would have asked yourself or some unfortunate lecturer this question: how do I criticize research? It is indeed a daunting task to hold a paper overflowing with jargon, statistical figures and gobbledygook. Where do I start? The task becomes even more daunting when the little voice within you starts to question your ability to criticize research produced by seasoned and experienced academics or researchers. Some of them may even be your lecturers. So who am I to criticize their research then? Now that you are fourth year students, it is perhaps time to burst the bubble and tell you the truth. Or perhaps you already know this. It doesn't really matter who writes the paper. There will always be some aspect of the research that is weak. Besides, researchers don't always produce perfect research all the time. Researchers are also humans. They make mistakes. They get tired and they get bored, just like some of you now who may be dozing off to my voice. So in view of that, my advice for what it's worth is, always evaluate research with a grain of salt. Some even recommend an entire shaker of salt, although I hope metaphorical salt doesn't contribute to further development of hypertension. Here are some of the aims of this lecture. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to approach a research paper and criticize it in a systematic manner. It is important to note that when we criticize research, we don't just look for the negative aspects of the paper. It is also equally important to evaluate the positive aspects of it as well. For example, a good research design or creative argumentative style. We should avoid the negative aspects, but learn from the positive aspects of any study that we read. There are different types of research papers, and you may already have encountered some of these. This lecture will only talk about quantitative research, that is research that handles data using numerical analytic techniques. The research paper is made up of different parts. The slide shows you the generic structure of how a paper usually looks like in a journal. As a teaching tool, novice research critiques are usually advised to evaluate a paper using this structure. This advice may also apply to advanced researchers, since it is much easier to break down a research into manageable chunks rather than swallow the whole thing down to prevent indigestion of the mind. We'll first start with the introduction section of a paper. This is the bit that will either make us want to read more or put off by the paper. Therefore, ideally, this is the section authors should place some emphasis in order to place the whole research into context. However, this doesn't always happen. Some papers' introduction section may contain a lot of information, but much of this information is irrelevant. The most common type of irrelevant information in clinical research is reporting the epidemiology of the condition that the research is about. The actual research may deal with the evaluation of a particular treatment for that condition. Although it is nice to have a little background information on the epidemiology, but it doesn't warrant 50% of the introduction section just devoted to this. This is a waste of the reader's time and adds nothing extra to the understanding of the research. This space may be more appropriately allocated to laying out the rationale or reasons why the research was conceived or should be considered important within the field of investigation. This brings us to the next thing we should be looking out for in the introduction section, the rationale of the study. When you've finished reading the entire introduction section, you should be quite clear by now what are the aims of the study and what is this justification for answering the research question. If you're still unsure or not convinced of the rationale of the research, it could be that the researchers don't have a clear idea of why they're doing this either, or they weren't particularly good at conveying the reasons to the readers through the writing. Or even worse, it could also be both. The main reason why we need a clear rationale for the research is because if we don't know why this research was done in the first place, how do we know what you are expected to find out from the research then? Assuming that the researcher has rambled on about the background and context of the research, the aims of the study is then translated into the hypothesis that he or she is trying to test using this study. It is not common practice to state the hypothesis within a paper, so you shouldn't expect to find an explicit statement about what the hypothesis is. This may be different from undergraduate or even some postgraduate dissertations, where the null hypothesis is sometimes explicitly written out. This is mainly for pedagogical reasons, but published papers don't require this. However, this doesn't mean that a piece of research is devoid of hypothesis. This goes back to the bit about the introduction section. A good introduction section will make the hypothesis apparent. Once the aims and hypothesis is known, the question you should be asking is, has the aims been stuck to or the hypothesis actually tested? Of course, you can't really answer this question until you have finished reading the entire paper. You may sometimes find out that by some unknown mystical power or sheer magic, new aims may actually appear at the end of the study. This is bad research practice. A study should have all its aims stated at the beginning of the research, and nothing new should be added later, lest the readers think that the researcher was trying to inflate the applicability of the research results. Now, before I finish talking about the introduction section, let me say something about assumptions. All of us hold assumptions about certain things. Researchers are not exempt from this. However, when I talk about assumptions within research, what I'm referring to is the accepted, shared basis of certain aspects of a theory, or some common, almost uncontestable tenets of a discipline, or what a procedure is trying to measure as accepted and shared by the community of researchers. Assumptions are important in that it makes the research easier to be defined and operationalized. However, it is important to occasionally question these assumptions from time to time to ensure that they are still appropriate for the research or discipline. Let me give you an example. Physios are often taught that tight muscles is not a good thing, and this should be corrected whenever possible. If there was a problem with a bodily region and it so happens that the muscles are tight there, then it is prudent to stretch those muscles in order to relieve the problem or prevent further occurrences. But the question is, all of us have different levels of muscular tenderness and ligamentous flexibility. If a person is naturally not very flexible, for example like myself, then does it mean that enforcing flexibility will definitely reduce the occurrence of any injury? There is even some research to suggest that stretching before vigorous exercise doesn't contribute to reduction of injury rates. So is the flexibility that important after all? Now, that was quite a lot of information just for the introduction section. Let's talk a little bit about the methods section now. The methods section is mainly to tell the readers the nitty-gritty of what was done to generate and collect the data. Some people find this the most boring bit of the paper, but unless you absolutely trust the researcher or is quite familiar with the researcher's technique, then it may be prudent to examine closely what was done for the research. The very first thing you should be looking for is the research design. This may be a one-liner stating what sort of research design was used, or you may have to read the methods section to figure it out for yourself. But what is more important is, did the study actually use the research design that was reported in it? Sometimes a particular research design may be reported, but you find out later that something doesn't look quite right. For example, many experimental or clinical studies yearn for the studies to be available, randomized controlled trials or RCTs, because it is considered the gold standard of research designs. So they may take every opportunity to classify their research as an RCT, even though the title may not be warranted in this case. Many studies say that that study is a RCT because aspects of the procedures were randomized. However, the actual definition for a study to be called randomized is when the participants are randomly allocated to the different treatment groups. This is one of the commonest mistakes in naming research designs. What the research design is also tells us something important about causality. That is, whether A, let's say an intervention, actually caused B, a change in a condition to happen. Only certain research designs allow certain levels of causality to be inferred from it. So if a research design doesn't allow a causal inference to be made, but the researcher proceeds to make it anyway, then an error of logic has been committed. It is time to dish out that proverbial spanking for the guy who actually wrote up that particular paper. For clinically related research, the research participants are one of the most important determinants of success of the research. Therefore, it is vitally important that the recruitment and selection of the participants are carefully planned. The two main goals of participant recruitment is to ensure that the intervention and control groups within the study are similar in as many aspects as possible, and also that the results generated from the participants are generalizable to the population of participants we are interested in. If the selection process or criteria for inclusion and exclusion are not rigorously planned, then the research could face two problems. The first problem is that the results may be wrongly generalized or could not be generalized to the population of interest. The second problem is that we are unsure whether the results that was found was because of the intervention or was it due to some characteristics of the participants in each group. Therefore, always examine the inclusion and exclusion criteria of the study as well as the recruitment process of the study carefully. Once the participants have walked through the door, the next step is to know how to allocate them into the study groups. Did the researchers randomly allocate the participants into groups, or was another allocation process utilized? Why did they do this? Other questions relating to the procedures need to be reported in the methods section. They are important for knowing how well the study was conducted and to know the strengths and limitations of the study. Some questions to ask about the methods sections are as follows. Is blinding of the researchers and participants achieved? If multiple procedures are given, were these procedures randomized? Is the intervention administered similar to how it's performed in the clinic? Are the validity and reliability of the procedures reported? Were the procedures standardized? These are just some of the questions that may be asked relating to the methods section, and it is not exhaustive. In the methods section, the analysis should also be stated in order to show that the analysis used was pre-planned and not done as an afterthought. There are several things to look out for in terms of the analysis. These are the sample size of the study, the power for determining the sample size, and what specific types of analysis and statistical tests will be used. Most journals now require the authors to explicitly state how they determine their sample sizes for clarity and openness. So you should do the same and look out for these things as well. As for the statistical test, what you're looking out for is whether the appropriate tests were carried out for that particular research design. Occasionally, the research design and statistical tests don't match, and doubts should be raised as to how much trust we can place on the results then. Okay, I'm getting a bit tired now. I'm sure you are as well. I'll stop here for the moment and recap what we've just covered in this lecture. Firstly, we talked about the introduction where the authors should provide you with the background and rationale for the research. The hypothesis and aims should be well justified so that we know the research is worth the read. We also looked at why assumptions held by the researchers may be important, and we should not take this for granted. Some aspects of the methods section was also covered, specifically looking at the recruitment of participants, the reporting of the procedures, and any planned analysis that is to be conducted. I hope this lecture has given you a basic structure to tackle the introduction and methods section. In my next lecture, we'll be looking at the results, discussion, and conclusion sections and see what sort of questions should we ask about these sections to better critique the paper. Okay then, I'll see you at the next lecture then. Bye for now.
Create your very own video podcast from PowerPoint. Log on to authorstream.com. It's absolutely free.
Hello there. Welcome to the second part of the narrated lectures on criticizing quantitative research. In our last lecture, we looked at the introduction and methods section of a research paper and asked some questions for evaluating the integrity and quality of the piece of research. In this lecture, we'll continue from where we stopped the last time and look at the results, discussion, and conclusion sections. If the methods section of a paper seemed boring to you, then the results section won't give you any more reason for cheering either. However, it is very important to scrutinize the results simply because it is the meat of the whole paper. Although I appreciate that not many people read the results and skip directly to the discussion or conclusion sections, it is nevertheless important to know how the results were reported. Sometimes you may note that certain things were said to be done in the methods section, but you've looked at the results section about 3 times now and you still haven't found the reported results for the aspect of the study yet. This missing result may constitute a small section of a paper. However, occasionally it may have implications for the interpretation of the outcomes. When you find that some results are missing, always ask yourself, is something funny going on here? What I mean by this is whether the researcher has deliberately left out certain bits of the result or even added in something extra to make the study look better. It may be that the researcher has genuine reasons for leaving those results out, but never assume this. As the old cliche goes, a picture paints 1,000 words. This could also apply to reporting results for a research paper. Graphical methods of reporting data analysis are very powerful tools if used appropriately. However, it is a pity that some researchers have abused this tool and used it for misleading rather than enlightening purposes. A good results section should include some form of graph for summarizing data at a glance. Always look at the figures and tables carefully. Are the figures and tables clearly drawn, labeled and explained using captions? Can you see any misleading aspects of the figures and tables? One of the most common tricks used for drawing graphs is plotting the data on only less than 1/3 of the entire graphical area. This would give the impression that the data points are relatively stable from point to point. Figure A is a graph that uses this little trick, whereas if the axis was redrawn such that the data is plotted on the entire graphical area, then it can be seen that the data points are actually rather variable, as shown on Figure B. Of course, the choice of the appropriate scale of the axes also depends on the precision of the measurements as well. Okay, here is my favorite bit. I can hear some of you in the background moaning already. How can I convince you that this is the most interesting bit of the whole paper? Look at it this way. The bit that uses the most jargon and numerical figures is also usually the bit that has the most errors or hanky-panky going-ons. The statistical analysis section fits this bill perfectly. Of course, in order to adequately assess the integrity of this section, the reader needs to have some basic knowledge of statistics. Not much, mind you, but just enough to spot any shenanigans happening. Some questions you may want to ask is, were the appropriate statistics used for this study? How do we know if the appropriate stats have been used? Well, this goes back to the bit about research design. Certain research designs are pre-planned in order to maximize the power of the study. This, coupled with the use of statistics that go well with that particular research design, can be very powerful indeed. The second question you may want to ask is, were the interpretation of the results reasonable? The statistics tests are simply mathematical manipulations of the data. The meaning that emerges from the statistics depends on the interpretation offered by the researchers. Sometimes, researchers may offer inappropriate interpretations of the outcomes of these tests. The third question you may want to ask is, were any additional tests that were not mentioned before reported here? Sometimes, researchers may do extra tests to examine the data in more detail. Although it is good that the researchers want to find something from the data, however, this practice is generally discouraged. This is because after-the-fact analyses or hindsight analysis will most likely yield some form of interesting results. It's like betting on horse racing. You can place your bets before the race, but after the race has ended, you can't change your mind then because you already know the results. This analogy also applies to the choice of the statistical tests. Another common error is to throw in as many tests as you can think of for analyzing the data. The reason is that if you throw enough tests at the data, something is bound to turn up significant. This is very bad practice and should be avoided. The discussion section is one of the most read sections of a paper, but frequently the worst written section. My guess is that because there is no official structure offered for writing discussion sections of a paper, so authors feel that it is a bit of a free-for-all. So what should we be looking out for in a discussion section? A good discussion section should have a relatively easy to follow flow of ideas. It should also provide a clear and concise summary of the results. Most importantly, it should offer reasonable interpretations of the results and place these in the context of past research. However, to do this may be harder than it sounds. There are many types of argumentative errors inherent in the discussion section. In the next slide, some of these logical errors will be pointed out. Listed on the slide are some of the logical errors commonly found in the discussion section. The top 3 sins of the discussion section are as follows. Sin number 1. Ignoring non-significant results and not offering an interpretation, hoping that the readers will soon forget it if they fail to mention it. Sin number 2. Non-significant results interpreted as proof of no effect. This is fallacious because a non-significant result simply means that insufficient evidence has been found to warrant a rejection of the null hypothesis. This is very different from proving the null hypothesis to be true. Sin number 3. Correlation does not imply causation. What this means is that just because two things are related or appear superficially related, it does not necessarily follow that either one of the things caused the other to happen. Take for example the relationship between the sale of soft drinks and drowning in Edinburgh swimming pools. If we found that when the sale of soft drinks increases, the number of swimming pool drowning also increases, does this necessarily mean that drinking soft drinks increases the likelihood of people drowning when they're swimming? Of course not. This relationship is spurious. It may simply be that a warmer weather has encouraged both the increase in sale of soft drinks and also increase in people to visit the swimming pool. Some papers may or may not include the applicability of the findings depending on the type of research paper. Usually basic research papers would not directly apply the research to specific settings, but would hint at generic applications of the findings. However, for clinical research, the application section should be explicit because the research is very much applied. It is important that the researchers offer some indication as to how the findings may influence current or future practice. Okay, we're almost done now. I've combined the conclusion and abstract sections together here simply because these sections serve as summary devices for the whole paper. The abstract should report accurately and succinctly the main points of the whole paper. This is important because the abstract is the first line of contact for readers searching for relevant papers to the topic of interest. As for the conclusion, it should accurately summarize the main points of the findings and provide closure for the paper so that readers feel that they have spent the last 30 minutes in a worthwhile manner. Always ensure that the conclusions are consistent with the rest of the paper. No additional information should be included at this point. After these two lectures, you may still be asking the question, how can I be good at critically evaluating research? There is no easy way around this. The best way is to keep on practicing and evaluating papers. The more you practice, the more your critical skills will be honed and you should get better at this. I hope that you've gained something from this lecture. Remember, never take anything that a paper reports at face value and always be vigilant for sloppy research. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye.
Create your very own video podcast from PowerPoint. Log on to authorstream.com. It's absolutely free.